Psychotic Polarity. Wow, this report is really difficult to talk about for me. It's something I tend to block out due to the trauma it caused me. As far as train wreck trip reports go, it's definitely not the worst, but it's a great example of what not to do. So leading up to the experience, I was a 19-year-old that didn't have a very great understanding of substance use. I was in denial of my addictive personality, coming to grips with the signs of mental health issues I have, and I had spent the last 3 or 4 months experimenting, more like abusing, Dextromethorphan. I had been enthralled with the spiritual and entheogenic aspects I had heard about it in regard to psychedelics. The visuals and intensity only added to my infatuation with tripping. Despite the glamorous lens through which I perceive psychedelics, I was well aware DXM has limited psychedelic potential and is technically classified as a dissociative. But many people, including myself, report psychedelic-like properties from the dissociative experience provided from drugs like DXM and ketamine. I was frustrated and disappointed in the visuals that DXM lacked and its physical load on my body. With time, however, I began to tolerate DXM much more, so to speak. I got past my nausea, I became very fond of the body high, warmth, and afterglow. I could see a sort of addiction forming, but chose to deny the signs under my psychedelic warrior ego that had developed. I probably chose the worst set and setting possible for this trip. I'm actually pretty lucky to be alive. I went into this experience with no attention to planning, no real intention, and a complete delusion that everything would be fine because I was special. I had developed DXM afterglow-induced mania. I'm much better handling at it now, but at the time my bipolar disorder was much worse. The night prior to the trip, I was unable to sleep because of my mental state. So, while rolling around in bed, I browsed around YouTube watching videos about various drugs. Eventually, I stumbled across a video about Diphenhydramine, or DPH for short. I was amazed that there was another over-the-counter medication with hallucinogenic properties. I didn't hesitate whatsoever. I knew I was going to try it for myself. I heard that it was a deliriant, that most people have a bad time, and that it's not the safest substance, but I had a sense of invulnerability that became my downfall. I watched a few more videos for research and went on the Psychonaut wiki page and read up on it further. I followed several see also links until the DXM and DPH page became my final inspiration. At this time, it was around 6 in the morning. I had to leave around 7:30 to go out of town so I could pay off the minor traffic ticket I had. I would have had my license suspended if I didn't go take care of it. Unfortunately, the ticket I had received was the result of a car accident in which I rear-ended a sub-pickup truck with a huge ball hitch attached. I was driving a small 4-door Nissan, and in the end my car was toast, as you might expect. The hitch on the truck went straight through the grill of my car and through the radiator and partially lodged itself firm to the actual engine, so I had to pay a fat fine for the ticket and was without a car. I got ready and found a ride there with a friend. By the time it was done and over with, I got back into my hometown around 10 a.m. and had just over $40 left. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. The minute I got home, I hopped on one of my bicycles and I rode across town to a pharmacy. I purchased the exact dose I planned to take via one box of generic allergy medication that totaled 600 milligrams of diphenhydramine hydrochloride and 2 bottles of the generic cough relief gel capsules that added up to the 600 milligrams dextromethorphan hydrobromide. This dose was idiotic, but I made more terrible decisions, many more. The memory makes me cringe. I rode my bike over to the so-called mall my town has. The mall was down to about 5 stores total and a movie theater, and most days it was practically empty in there. I decided this was a suitable place, and I, bold as fuck, no shame at all, opened up all the pills and downed them right there in front of the mall entrance, threw away my trash, and walked in the mall. I'm not sure what I expected from the experience, but within an hour of wandering around the mall bored, I began to feel incredibly uneasy and anxious of my decision to do this alone. I knew I fucked up. I needed someone there with me, so I got my girlfriend to come to the mall. I was ignorant of the onset of the diphenhydramine, but I was noticeably disturbed by the time she got there. I was wandering around if I was looking for something when she found me. I was both gutted with fear and relieved to have her with me. I knew I had to tell her about the drugs I took, but I knew she would be disappointed in me, sad, hurt, and scared. When I opened my mouth to confess, my speech abilities began to fade away. I stuttered and restarted whole phrases trying to get my words out. I was already beginning to feel strange. I had a weird mental fog. I didn't trust my own inner dialogue. My memory felt impaired. I felt like something was wrong with me. I thought I was going to pass out soon. I decided to inform my girlfriend of my inevitable intoxication and what I had took. She grew cold towards me, and I could see in her face I had hurt her with my actions. I'm still with her currently in 2018, and I can honestly say this day is one of the most shame and guilt-inducing memories of my life. Soon, I lost the clarity in my vision. Everything in my visual field grew more dim and less defined. My speech began to break and lose its coherence. I had syllables that scooted from phrases, stuttering, clipping, abrupt and choppy stops in speech, sometimes mid-word, mid-sentence, or in the last syllable of a word, and a robotic, monotone voice replacing my own. I heard the sounds coming from my mouth and internally shuddered with discomfort. I knew I had made a mistake. Not long after this point, I passed the level of self-analysis and had entered an almost careless state of dissociation. I repeatedly stood up to explore my surroundings, but my girlfriend would tell me to sit down every time. I was surprised at my own ability to move around and actually walk around, considering DXM alone would cause me to stumble and stagger around. I'm sure I wasn't walking with normal speed or motion, but I didn't fall or misstep either. The act of moving felt strange and foreign. When I would walk, my feet felt as if they were vibrating, and the ground felt like it was made of sponge. I felt some fairly strong euphoria from waving my arms around, but my girlfriend told me to stop, so I did. The level of obedience I had is very interesting to me. Scopolamine and being controlled comes to mind when I think about it. I would follow any commands with no consideration or hesitation during the experience. So, right around the 3-hour mark, my memory of the experience became incredibly distorted and mixed up in terms of the sequence of events. I'm sure there's gaps of lost memory because amnesia would explain some time lapses in my recollection of the experience. I'm going to do my best to piece together the rest of the trip. It must have been soon after the 3-hour mark that I started to have full-blown open-eye hallucinations. I'm almost certain that the first hallucination was a non-existent layer of 3D depth that was on the patterns of the carpet. The carpet in reality had a random Persian rug design, but I saw the lines as bars floating just above the ground. They would disappear if I tried to grab them, but they would always return as soon as I looked away and looked back. The fashion in which they would disappear was of a ghostly vanishing style. The carpet hallucination developed further into three-dimensional cubes that hovered in between the gaps in the lines. The cubes appeared to be made of antique wood, and I decided they were toys. The cubes, however, were interactive, and I could actually grab them in my hands. I don't think I felt them, but I didn't really care about that because I was busy moving them around like building blocks. I had a pretty nice time playing with them. I'm surprised that they were interactive at all. If I sat one of the blocks anywhere, it would stay there. Gravity did not affect the hallucinatory cubes at all. I'm going to assume the next hallucination that came after the blocks would have to be the phantom dog. I distinctively recall rejoicing aloud of the arrival of the dog. My girlfriend, of course, told me that there was in fact no dog. I heard her, but it didn't change anything. Before the dog arrived, I was intently staring at a portion of the wall. I was having brief glimpses of indistinguishable objects in the wall. Eventually, the wall took the form of an altar like what would be an old temple in an Indiana Jones film. From the altar, the dog materialized. The dog at first appeared to be partially translucent and not fully defined. He moved around autonomously just as a real dog would. Within a few moments, he had become more like a hologram, and his appearance and the texture of his fur was shaking as if it were glitching. He looked like he was a German Shepherd, or some similar breed of dog, and was about the same size too. His color ranged from tints of gray to shifting blues and greens. He eventually gained an almost solid density, but his fur never ceased shaking and jittering around. I'm going to guess that the somewhat unrealistic forms of hallucinations that I experienced were a result of the DXM. DPH alone tends to offer much more concrete and unpleasant realistic apparitions such as shadow people and spiders. I'm a lot more fond of the toy blocks and my dog than anything that would invoke fear in me. Despite the lack of realness to the hallucinations, I was completely convinced of them being real during the experience. My memory of the sequence of events from this point forward is drastically distorted through the delirium-induced amnesia. At some point my girlfriend had enough and decided to get me to the hospital. I didn't resist for some reason. I was put in the ER relatively quickly, and when I went to lie down on my hospital bed, I saw a big hairy spider crawling along the wall next to my bed. It was a dark orange color with faint blue stripes on its legs. The head of the creature was that of a house cat, and the whole creature appeared to have the texture of yarn. It looked a bit like a sentient ragdoll. I, of course, went to pet the 8-legged acronid kitty just to see it disappear into the wall. At this time, I have to assume that I blacked out or something because I have memories from when I was still at the mall taking place after that cat spider at the hospital. I'm going to guess that time and chronological sequence of events are abandoned at a certain point when the brain is trying to make sense of everything. I vividly remember sitting on the couch at the mall where the majority of the trip took place and being completely fixated on this discolored patch in the paint on the wall across from me. I'm not entirely certain if the slightly off stain in the paint is actually real at all, but it's possible. As I gazed at the wall, I noticed the shape of the patch slowly morphing its edges. The shape would grow and shrink. It would breathe and shudder around like a caged animal. I thought to myself about how intriguing it was, and as if my thoughts triggered the activation of the wall, I watched as the stain lifted from the wall like smoke in the shape of a flag. It glinched and jumped around, waving as if it had a movement disorder. It had no consistent pattern of movement, but I could mentally interact with it, causing it to move closer or farther from the wall. The farther I took it from the wall, the larger it grew, and when closer to the wall, it returned to its original size. Like I said, I remember this happening after I had left the mall, so it's even more bizarre that it sticks out so vividly in my memory. After this, I relived the events of the day prior to the hospital in my head over and over again. I wasn't sure if any of it had happened or was still happening. I was having fully realistic closed-eye visualizations of my actions that day. This went on for a few hours before I almost abruptly felt normal. I realized I had to use the bathroom, and when I stood up, I noticed that a male nurse was babysitting me across the room. I looked alarmed and he said, "Oh, hey, where do you think you're going?" I calmly said, "I gotta pee." He handed me a large bottle that is basically a medical-grade piss cup. Once done, he took my generous sample and left the room. About an hour later, the psychiatrist was there to evaluate my sanity. She was probably around 50 years old, short gray hair, a heavy set, but she looked tough if that makes any sense. I recognized her from a previous trip to the hospital that I had had previously for alcohol poisoning. I'm not sure if she recognized me. If so, she didn't comment on it. She asked a series of obvious questions like, what day is it, who's the president of the United States, what state are we in, etc. Next, she went over all the drugs I tested positive for from their urinalysis screen. According to them, I had marijuana, MDMA, PCP, opiates, and designer drugs in my system. I debated with her about this, knowing it was false. False positives for PCP and opiates are common for DXM use. I have no idea when or if I accidentally ingested Molly, but I think it was also a mistake. The marijuana was accurate though, and I suppose the designer drugs she mentioned could have been either another false positive or possibly from some laced weed, but I doubt the later of the two possibilities. I was released several minutes later. I got home to realize my pupils were still incredibly dilated, and I experienced muscle spasms in my legs for the next several days. This is a little alarming considering muscle rigidity around the knee is an indicator of serotonin toxicity. I called my girlfriend before going to bed. It was almost midnight at the time. I had to apologize repeatedly. She was shaken up pretty bad. She cried while I was in the hospital. I have so much guilt and trauma from that experience. I feel horrible that I did that to myself and put her through that. I'm thankful, however, because having her there could have easily saved me from a much worse outcome. We've both moved on from it, but I still have a lot of shame for my decisions that day. I had a hangover including fatigue, apathy, and depression for at least a week afterwards, effectively ending the manic phase I was in previously. All in all, I learned a few things from my mistakes, and that trip put a halt to my abuse of over-the-counter medication. I never would have thought that such incredibly real but fantastical lucid hallucinations were possible. The experience was essentially a headfirst dive into complete psychosis. I wouldn't recommend it, but I'm not totally opposed to potential enjoyment some may get from an experience like this. I'm honestly just happy I made it out with my sanity.